On this episode of Newt's World, when modern medicine issues recommendations based on good scientific studies, it shines. Conversely, when modern medicine is interpreted through the harsh lens of opinion and edict, it can mold beliefs that harm patients and stunt research for decades. In his new book, Blind Spots, When Medicine Gets It Wrong and What It Means for Our Health, Dr. Marty Makary explores the latest research on critical topics ranging from the microbiome to childbirth to nutrition, longevity, and more, revealing the biggest blind spots of modern medicine and tackling the most urgent yet unsung issues in our $4.5 trillion healthcare system. Here to discuss his new book, I am really pleased to welcome my guest. Dr. Marty Makary is a Johns Hopkins professor, member of the National Academy of Medicine, author of 2 New York Times best-selling books on Accountable and The Price We Pay. He has written for the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the New York Times, and published more than 250 scientific research articles. Marty, welcome and thank you for joining me again on Newt's World.
Good to see you, Newt. Thanks for having me.
You know, when I look at your productivity, you must really like working.
I do. You know, when you have a sense of purpose, it's not a job, and you know that better than anyone.
But still, 250 scientific publications is a remarkable achievement, as well as best-selling books.
It hit me after 200 scientific publications that nobody's reading them, but I get to summarize them in my presentations.
There you go. You know, when we last talked with one another, we discussed your last book, The Price We Pay, What Broke American Healthcare and How to Fix It, which did become a New York Times bestseller. And you really called out the healthcare system as a whole and how it needs to be overhauled. Before we get to your new book, talk to us for a couple minutes about what you were trying to accomplish with The Price We Pay.
Well, really, we have a tremendous amount of waste in healthcare. We have really a decision that we have to make as a country. Are we going to increase spending on healthcare, throwing good money after bad into this broken system, or are we going to cut the waste? And so the fundamental problem in healthcare is we have non-competitive markets, and you can either try to create rules around bad behavior, or you can enable them to be competitive with price transparency and quality transparency. So thanks to President Trump, that book was really converted into the executive order from the White House to require hospitals to post cash prices on common shoppable services. And that is taking effect this year, and third-party companies are scraping that data, and pretty soon you'll be able to access it on an app.
We do a fair amount of work on transparency, and the country gets it. But the systems, of course, that are supposed to be transparent all do everything they can to oppose it, which includes the hospitals, the pharmaceuticals, the pharmaceutical management systems, the insurance companies. Don't you find that same experience that each of them has their own sense of how they can game the system, and they're not particularly excited about letting you know the details?
That's right. Look, this healthcare system is making a lot of people rich. We're generating thousands of new millionaires every year. And it's working for a lot of people who are using the system to get wealthy. But when it comes to actually making the population healthier, we have failed. For 50 years, we have failed. When it comes to increasing the efficiency of our system, we have failed. So everyone's getting rich in healthcare except for one stakeholder that does not have a big lobby in DC, and that is the everyday American worker who pays for this giant mess through their paycheck deduction for health insurance and their Medicare excise tax, which all go up each year.
When I left the speakership, I decided I would focus on national security and on healthcare as the 2 biggest life-threatening and economically powerful sectors of our economy. And I was really surprised after about 5 years to realize the huge elements of the health system are entirely self-serving and redefine the rules around their own pocketbook. I mean, is that sort of part of what you've also encountered?
Yes. It's like you can make changes to healthcare as long as you really don't affect these giant revenue streams that are going to these giant corporate stakeholders. And then we get a lot of shiny objects thrown at us. Medicare can now negotiate the prices of 10 generic drugs. Well, according to their own numbers, that's a $6 billion savings in a healthcare system that is $4.5 trillion, expanding in the commercial market by 8% each year. That's a $200 billion expansion. You saved 6 of those $200 billion? Congratulations. We are not dealing with the root causes, what is causing all of these chronic diseases, and we just get these shiny objects thrown at us that may have merits of their own, but they're in the periphery. They are not the core issue.
In your new book, you're coming at this from sort of the patient care standpoint and the notion that the medical profession can have blind spots. You're practicing, you're in a major institution. When did it suddenly hit you that there were blind spots?
Well, it's always hit me because I took time out of medical school to do a public health degree and look at the macro. We have actually created and ignited health crises as a medical profession. But during COVID is when I felt like I didn't want to write about COVID. It was too tribal and people are sick of it. But I wanted to write about this culture of our medical establishment. They said opioids were not addictive for 20 years, igniting the opioid epidemic. They said peanut allergies were caused by early peanut butter exposure. They got that backwards for most of the last quarter century, igniting the modern day peanut allergy epidemic. Doesn't exist in Africa. The overuse of antibiotics, the food pyramid misinformation, all of this was propagated. As we demonized natural saturated fats, we developed these massive blind spots of our ultra-processed foods, refined carbohydrates, pesticides, seed oils, and we ignored all of these main drivers of our chronic disease epidemic. As all of these chronic diseases surged right in front of our eyes, what did we do? We just doubled down on the old dogma. So I wanted people to know the truth.
Walk me through what we have been doing wrong and why none of that applies, say, in Africa.
Well, in a prior generation, peanut allergies were rare and most were mild. But then, in the year 2000, the American Academy of Pediatrics ignited the modern-day peanut allergy epidemic with a bad recommendation for all mothers to make sure kids avoid peanut butter until they turn 3, thinking that peanut butter abstinence in the first few years of life would prevent peanut allergies later. But they got it perfectly backwards. They did not incorporate the basic concept of immune tolerance, or the old dirt theory, which means when you're around things as an infant, your body's more likely to accept them later in life. And so as peanut allergies skyrocketed with this bad recommendation from the American Academy of Pediatrics, more kids developed peanut allergies, including severe peanut allergies, just having trouble breathing, being near a peanut without even touching a peanut. And that meant more peanut abstinence. They got rid of peanuts in schools and daycare centers, in homes. They said, well, you know what? We're going to make sure there's no peanut butter in the home. And so it became this vicious, perpetual cycle. Finally, the study got done 8 years ago that showed you want to introduce peanut butter early in infancy and not avoid it, and that we had it perfectly backwards.
I mean, aren't there a whole series of places where what we're currently doing in the name of good science is in fact bad science?
Absolutely. We see it all the time. Dogma. It is the world of medical dogma. And sometimes it's rooted in good intentions. But the most dangerous thing you can do in all of science is to put something out there, put a health recommendation out there in the public with such absolutism as if it's backed by science when it's not. It's just an opinion or a hunch or a gut feeling.
There's a sociological component and there's an economic component. So the big, powerful groups are making tons of money. They have good reason for sustaining their approaches. But at the same time, there are also just cultural patterns and habits and things that people have decided they collectively agree, and they punish. So the one group punishes you for having broken sort of the cultural groupthink. The other group punishes you for threatening their income. And the two are often mutually reinforcing. I mean, does that make any sense?
It does. And here's the thing. When we get something wrong, when the groupthink in medicine, including with industry fanning the flame, when we get something so wrong and then we realize we get it wrong, you don't see a reckoning. You don't see humility. You don't see an apology. You don't see a clarification to tell people the correct recommendation with the same vigor by which the misinformation recommendation was put out prior by the medical establishment. And as a result, people lose trust in the medical establishment. You saw it during COVID. I have not heard a single apology from any public health official during the prolonged school shutdowns and the masking of toddlers and not allowing people to visit their dying loved ones in a hospital for 2 years, a cruel human rights violation. All of it, vaccine mandates, all of it. You have not seen a single apology. And I think that's why trust in doctors and hospitals is way down. It's down from 71% to 40% of the public in a recent study that was just published in our top journal. That's a 31-point drop in trust in doctors and hospitals. People are hungry for honesty.
I was very struck with the sort of rigidity which started, say, with medical decisions, but then went over to, for example, the social media. So if you tried to say the wrong thing, you couldn't say it on Facebook because they just literally would block you. I mean, it's probably as much suppression of dissident thought as we've seen in American history.
And it's interesting, it's not new. It's a sneak peek into how the broader medical establishment works. And it's, I think, worse now than ever before. The censorship is so overt. But when people started saying, hey, there's nothing wrong with natural fat, it's refined carbohydrates and added sugar that's creating this inflammation and these diseases, they were railroaded, sidelined, and censored in their own day. The people who said, no, opioids are addictive, they were sidelined by the industry and the medical establishment. And so what we learned from all of these medical mishaps, some of which are still active to this day, is that we need civil discourse more than ever. And in medicine, the purpose of medicine and science is to challenge deeply held assumptions. And that's what we need to encourage, not to censor.
Aren't we also faced with the reality that many of the supposedly professional groups, I'm thinking, for example, about the American Medical Association, has such a huge, compelling interest in not being in a fight with the government, that if the government doctors, say at the Center for Disease Control, take a certain position, for the AMA to take that position head on could potentially lose them an enormous leverage that they currently have in making money off of being able to cite the description and the diagnosis of medicines, which the government has granted them in effect as a monopoly. So you have this mixing that's partly government, partly large private corporations, and partly associations that you would think would be oriented towards trying to find the truth, but in fact, they have significant leverage against them breaking out.
Yes. And what some of us have learned is that in addressing this government corruption, we discovered that many of our health agencies, some of which are supposed to be regulatory agencies, have created little foundations on the side where they accept millions from the pharmaceutical industry. Same thing's happening in the private sector with the American Medical Association, accepting millions from industry. And all of these organizations, and you wonder, how do these stakeholders have such enormous capture of both government doctors, government agencies, government policy, and in the private sector with our established medical organizations? I spoke at the annual nutrition conference for the nation's nutritionists and dietitians. And I find out after I gave my keynote that the milk lobby was there nitpicking my speech when I was questioning, do we really need 3 glasses of cow's milk a day for every healthy adult? That's the current recommendation. And as I challenge these deeply held assumptions, I find out they're one of the 2 big sponsors of the nutrition conference. The other sponsor was Coca-Cola. Now, I'm not saying they're bad companies, but should we really be having them have such a heavy hand in academic medicine and in our policymaking? So we need people to stand up, challenge these deeply held assumptions in the field, take a stand and talk about the big issues we're not talking about, like the best way to lower drug prices in America is to stop taking drugs we don't need.
But how would you know that?
There's a pendulum where you see it, for example, with childbirth. There's the over-medicalization of childbirth, and then people swing the other way to say, well, I'm just going to deliver my baby in the woods with no one around me. That's dangerous too. So there's a balance, right? And with medicine, a bunch of us now, Casey Means, myself, Peter Attia, we're going directly to the public to try to educate people about what the best tests are to look for your heart disease risk, what foods you should be eating, which drugs are commonly overused. And all of these decisions should be made with a physician. But the more antidepressants we prescribe, the more depression there is. The more ADHD meds we prescribe, the more ADHD there is. The more pain meds we prescribe, the more pain there is. Diabetes meds, more diabetes. Obesity meds, more diabetes. What is going on? It's not that the meds have a causal effect in inducing these diseases. It's that we're missing the boat. In some cases, we're engaging in the medicalization of ordinary life, but we're not dealing with the root issues. Was a child really made to have their circadian rhythm destroyed by waking up at some early hour, not because it's good for their health, but because it's convenient for adults? Put them in a classroom after a dogma that breakfast is the most important meal of the day. We load them with these sugary cereals. Turns out that's not a medical principle that breakfast is the most important meal of the day. It is an advertising campaign from Kellogg's in the 1950s that's taken on its own folklore legend status. And then we give them a food coma after lunch, and we tell them to sit sedentary at a desk. And if they can't do it, we medicate them. We have a diagnosis and we medicate them. We've got to deal with these root causes and not just medicate and play whack-a-mole. That's why healthcare is so expensive. We are not addressing these root causes, these issues that have been in our blind spots.
One of my favorite recent podcasts was on Fat Bear Week. I mean, I love the natural world. Well, if you go out and you look in the natural world, it turns out that from an evolutionary basis, we're really remarkably tough. We've survived a long time now as a species, and we are pretty resilient. And a lot of the time, if you just let us alone, we gradually come back to being in pretty good shape. And if you suppress different things, that has all sorts of second and third order implications that then become sort of a downward spiral. So when you take the first three drugs, then you have to take the next three drugs because the first three had side effects, and then you have to take the next three drugs. And so you become sort of a country that wanders around on pills when a lot of the time, it's fine. You're okay.
Yeah. You're saying something so important here, Newt. And I love being a doctor. I prescribe medications. I need patients to be compliant and take them. I've seen antibiotics save lives. But they're also massively overused. Antibiotics in particular. 60% of them are unnecessary, according to a big study. We've created this consumerist culture. And what's happening is we're altering the gut microbiome of a generation of people. These antibiotics carpet bomb the microbiome. So we're not talking about a lot of these big issues that we need to be talking about. And part of it is sometimes this sort of churning. When we're so busy billing and prescribing, so busy seeing patients and operating, we're on the treadmill as doctors in this healthcare system. We don't stop and ask, what is going on? The public is getting sicker, and we have now the sickest population in the history of the world and the most medicated. All of these diseases. I'm a pancreatic cancer surgeon. I deal with all kinds of pancreatic diseases at Johns Hopkins. No one has stopped and asked, hey, why have pancreatic cancer cases doubled in the last 2 decades? Like, no one's working on that. These are the root issues. We've got to stop.
What's your guess?
I think it's because of all the things. Well, first of all, the trend is the cancers that line the GI tract are the ones on the rise. Liver cancer, colon cancer, rectal cancer, gallbladder, biliary cancer, pancreas cancer. So what's that tell us? It tells us it's the interface between what we're ingesting, what we're eating, and the proximity of these tumors. So I think it tells us, it suggests that it's what we're putting down our system. There was a study that found a bacteria was identified in 50% of colon cancers in young people. The bacteria normally lives in the mouth, not in the colon. So what's happening with the microbiome, the millions of different bacteria that normally live in a balance have translocated. We've altered it. We mess it up with millions of things in the modern world. namely our poison food supply. If these pesticides kill insects, what do you think they're doing to the lining of our GI tract that's lined with millions of different healthy bacteria?
How much of the resistance to an open pursuit of scientific information and scientific data is cultural and how much of it's economic?
We saw during COVID how much of it is cultural within the medical field. This blind allegiance to the idea that there's no such thing as natural immunity to COVID. You saw like a third of doctors clinging to that, almost like some blind political allegiance. Well, actually, probably was a blind political allegiance. And you saw this sort of very damaging groupthink. It's different in different situations.
One of the things I thought was truly fascinating in your work was when you deal with hormone replacement therapy for women in menopause, and it turned out the initial studies that got us to back off of it was that we thought it caused breast cancer. Later on, turned out that wasn't true. But then there are positive side effects that apparently, in terms of Alzheimer's and fractures and heart disease, are actually positive. Can you sort of walk us through what's the current state of play in terms of hormone replacement therapy, and how should women think about it?
There is so much misinformation around hormone replacement therapy because a doctor at the NIH 22 years ago announced that it causes breast cancer. We're talking about if you take estrogen once your body's not producing it, or estrogen plus progesterone, what we call hormone replacement therapy when your body begins perimenopause. Typically between the ages of 45 and 57, somewhere in that ballpark, a woman will start to have those hormonal changes. Well, replacing estrogen, that is the hormone replacement therapy, not only alleviates the symptoms of menopause, the hot flashes, night sweats, mood swings, weight gain, and 50 plus other different symptoms that can occur, but it also has these long-term health benefits that you touched on, and that is women live 3.5 years longer. The rate of heart attacks is cut in half. The risk of Alzheimer's goes down by 35%. Their bones are stronger. Cognitive decline is 50 to 60% decreased. These are tremendous long-term health benefits, but tragically, many women are never offered it because most doctors today still believe the dogma from that original announcement where a guy said, I just did a study and found that it causes breast cancer. Turns out that study was released 2 weeks later, and in the data, it did not increase the risk of breast cancer. The media ran with the headlines in those 2 weeks and had convinced the public and doctors alike we're still digging out. And it's because that doctor created a tremendous amount of fear around hormone therapy, around one of the most sensitive issues for women, and that is the risk of getting breast cancer.
Are there any medical schools that have sort of gotten this message and are trying to reshape how they teach medicine?
The problem with medical school, Newt, is that every medical school curricula and big exams are controlled by one private company called the AAMC. And so it's not like college, where colleges can innovate and try new models and teach what they think is important and adapt to the times. There's some crusty board over there at the AAMC that's deciding that every kid needs to memorize the names of the molecules in the Krebs cycle. You don't need to be memorized and regurgitate that 5 different times in your education. You need to understand it, but we've created this memorize, regurgitate culture, and they come out memorizing all these medications with a reflex, prescribe them. We've lost a sense of compassion, holistic care, the appropriateness of medicine. And so it's a terrible system. And that's why nutrition has gotten no time in medical schools, and we don't talk about end of life and other important listening skills and non-technical skills. These are the issues we need to be talking about. I think we spent 2 minutes on menopause in medical school. A woman today is more likely to be prescribed an antidepressant for menopause than they are basic hormone replacement.
When you think about it, you have really sort of obsolete medical schools training people to be obsolete. So they then go out to work with people already out there who are obsolete, who reinforce the correctness of being obsolete. I mean, you're climbing a really big mountain.
Well, there's a bunch of us. It's Casey Means, Peter Attia, Vinay Prasad, many of us now in the medical profession, Mark Hyman. We're getting off the hamster wheel and we're talking about how do we tell the truth about health? How do we cut through the misinformation? How do we address these big issues that have been in our blind spots? And how do we stop focusing on sickness and start focusing on health? So I think there's a tribe now. There's a group of us now that are pushing hard. And what we find is that doctors are hungry for this because we've done a terrible thing to doctors in this country. We've told them, put your head down, focus on billing and coding. We're going to measure you by your throughput. And we haven't given doctors the time or resources to address these root causes. And they see all these chronic diseases skyrocket. I mean, autism is now 1 in 22 kids born in California. Half of our nation's children are obese or overweight or have prediabetes. We've got autoimmune diseases are surging. They now affect 1 in 5 women. Doctors see that we are missing the mark. And why do you think doctor burnout rates are now at 35%? And we have the highest suicide rate in the country. We need to change this system, get off the hamster wheel, and finally talk about health, not just sickness.
Can I ask you about one thing which I candidly don't know much about? And that is, tell me a little bit about GLP-1 drugs.
Yeah, so that's the Ozempic medications. GLP-1s are ideal for somebody who needs help transitioning to better foods, a healthier lifestyle, and more activity. When people go on GLP-1s, it's important that they get their protein with a high-protein diet, that they're active, or they're going to be on it for life. And you don't want to be on these medications for life. And tragically, because it's the easy button, I think a lot of people see their health as their figure and not as their physiology. We're seeing people now with accelerated frailty, reduced muscle mass, nutritional deficiencies, but because they're thin, they perceive that they are healthy. It's important to get your protein and it's important to stay active. They may be a miracle in the short term. That is what we see as people lose a tremendous amount of weight and we see some of these short-term health benefits go away. But they are also reducing muscle mass. They're not just reducing your excess body fat, they're reducing muscle mass. And that could be dangerous because the number one predictor of how long you live is how much muscle mass one has. And so are we advancing frailty? Are we accelerating aging? Are we shortening lifespan in the long term by reducing one's muscle mass? That verdict is still out. We don't know the answer.
Let me ask you one last sort of gigantic question. If you're an average, relatively healthy American, but you want to maintain that balance, you want to know what you should be doing, what is it you need to know and what is it you should focus on to be able to optimize your health and minimize the need for intervention?
So a couple highlights from the book. People should eat whole foods, things that grow out of good soil. Avoid seed oils. Avoid ultra-processed foods. Try to eat organic anytime you're eating something where you're actually consuming the surface of that fruit or vegetable. The average strawberry has been sprayed over a dozen times. You don't want that in your microbiome. And then when you go to your doctor, try to make sure that you get at some point a blood test called a lipoprotein A and an ApoB. These are the best predictors of early heart disease. They're much more predictive than HDL and LDL. And it's something that can help a doctor be more precise in prescribing how to prevent heart disease more aggressively in some people than others.
But we're beginning to see a movement, particularly now that you live in an age of social media where people can talk to each other and communicate with each other, that could acquire critical mass.
That's right. You know, it's like in your world of politics, there was the corporate media. You had a couple giant corporations that controlled what everybody would hear. Now you've got independent people. You've got podcasts and people can read independent journalists. Well, same thing in medicine. It used to be that a small group of people at the top were the priesthood and controlled all the recommendations and they would put out the food pyramid and they would silence the dissent. Now you've got podcasts and books. We've also got this tremendous new enthusiasm to finally address chronic diseases in children in America, something that should be nonpartisan, addressing our poison food supply. And so there are plans. I don't know if it's finalized yet. I think by the time this airs, it will be. But next week, RFK Jr., President Trump, Tulsi Gabbard, myself, and 3 other doctors will be doing a town hall virtually, and people can hear about these issues and hear about this new enthusiasm, this new interest to finally address the chronic disease epidemic afflicting our nation's children, causing tremendous suffering. Half of our nation's children are sick. We can't just keep medicating. We've got to talk about our food supply.
I have to ask you one question that I'm a little timid about asking. When I was Speaker, we balanced the budget for the only 4 times in your lifetime. But in the process of that, we were convinced that the work NIH does is so extraordinarily important that we actually doubled the NIH budget while we were cutting lots of other things. I now look and I wonder to what degree it has become so bureaucratic that it actually inhibits real breakthroughs because it overfunds marginal small grants. And the politics that are normal with human beings has unfortunately also infected NIH, and it showed up a lot in the COVID case. On balance, is NIH a useful thing or is it a diversion?
We need fresh leadership there. We have seen where the NIH has spent their money, and it's not on food as medicine and the general root causes of many of our chronic diseases. It's on some old legacy ideas of an old guard medical establishment, trying to figure out chemical pathways so we can give more drugs. There's a role for that, but we've got to have a balanced approach. And we got a little peek in 2020 where the NIH was spending their money. It wasn't on studying school lunch programs. It was on studying bat coronaviruses in China retrieved from caves 200 miles away. What are we doing? What are we spending our money on? There's so much waste. We could be directing that money to good causes, to good research on root causes. And that's what they're supposed to be doing. There's a lot of important stuff out there that needs to be funded. I think we need fresh new leadership. They have one microbiome unit. I talked to the person running it. Gut health is central to all health. That should be a bigger part. And these indirects, are you familiar with the indirects that the NIH gives out? So if they give a grant to a university like my university, Johns Hopkins, let's say I win a $3 million grant for my research team. I get the $3 million for the research, but then the dean gets a $2 million sort of gift for a slush fund to use for any indirect expenses potentially related to the research. Well, that's what's funding all the DEI. Do we need 5 deans of diversity in our medical school as we have had? Can we get by on 1? I mean, this is where NIH dollars are going. They should be going to science.
It should be kept, but pretty dramatically overhauled.
It's supposed to complement what the pharma industry is not funding.
That's helpful. Marty, I want to thank you for joining me again. I can't wait for whatever book you're going to do next so we can have another great conversation. But your new book, Blind Spots, When Medicine Gets It Wrong and What It Means for Our Health, is available now on Amazon and in bookstores everywhere. We're going to feature a link to buy it from our show page. I think it's a critically important book, and I want to encourage you to continue to link out and find more and more people. And maybe at some point down the road, we could do some interesting things about putting together, whether in my newsletter or in some articles, that there is a growing movement that actually wants to understand health as health and not health as drugs.
That's right. The H in NIH stands for health and the F in FDA stands for food.
Right. So I appreciate very much your being with me.
Thanks, Newt. Really good to see you again.
Thank you to my guest, Dr. Marty Makary. You can get a link to buy his new book, Blind Spots, on our show page at newsworld.com. Newsworld is produced by Gingrich 360 and iHeartMedia. Our executive producer is Garnsey Sloan. Our researcher is Rachel Peterson. The artwork for the show was created by Steve Penley. Special thanks to the team at Gingrich 360. If you've been enjoying Newsworld, I hope you'll go to Apple Podcast and both rate us with 5 stars and give us a review so others can learn what it's all about. Right now, listeners of Newsworld can sign up for my 3 free weekly columns at gingrich360.com/newsletter. I'm Newt Gingrich. This is Newsworld.